Hello everybody, welcome to another exciting tutorial in tyFlow. This time it is Disintegration, and I'm going to play this for you real quick. This is a skull, the same from my Arnold volume displacement tutorial. And we're going to do something similar to that. We will be using a sphere though, because this is a Creative Commons licensed object that I do not own. It's to download for free. You just Google 3D skin, skull, download, whatever, and you'll find this or similar. But this is the basic thing we're going to do, some disintegration. This is entirely done in tyFlow, no other plugins. And it's very exciting, and it's not actually really slow, it's pretty fast. So that's what I have in mind for this one. I want to shout out to Will Wallace, who did the original awesome disintegration tutorial in Thinking Particles. He is I'm Your Friend on Vimeo. You can go to his Vimeo page. This was the comp. He has a disintegration tutorial here. If you scroll down, it'll be further down. It's been a minute. Right here, Ash tutorial. Setup, step 2, step 3, this tutorial. So I just want to, step 1 is here. I want to give a shout out to Will, because that's also another awesome disintegration video. Now for mine, I got inspired by two things. Here's a Vimeo on video. Video on Vimeo, of course, in reverse. That's super cool, I thought, and that inspired me to do my version of this tutorial. This is one of the videos. Check it out. Also, this is on Vimeo. Then the other thing is this amazing disintegration effect done in Houdini. I'm actually logged in right now to CG Circuit. I own this tutorial. I'm gonna check it out in Houdini. But that also along here, great inspiration for what I had in mind. Again, the skull is the same as in my Arnold volume displacement tutorial. In this one I talk about where I got it, I believe, so check that out please. tyFlow wise, I will be using the latest tyFlow, which is the 68 ending version from February 2nd. Today is the 7th, so it's the latest there is. Also, check out the example files. I will be, probably, if time permits, will go over two trigger mechanisms for the skull. One is texture map, and two is using a neighboring test. And that is part of one of the example files you should check out. Also, I'm Ansi von Seherr-Thoss, of course. You can find me on LinkedIn. And lastly, we have our wonderful tyFlow Facebook group to check out. And join that if you haven't yet. This is real-time help, basically. Nobody uses forums anymore and such. Join the tyFlow Facebook group for the latest updates on the plugin. So let's jump into Max. Alright, so here's my basic scene. This is a geosphere at 000 world in our grid center right here. It has a radius of 50, which my units are generic and centimeters, if that matters to you. And I put 32 segments because we're going to use face fracture in tyFlow, and the more faces you have, the more beautiful your jaggedy edges are, and so on and so forth. So this is our geosphere. If you change the display to material color, this has an animated radial gradient on it. Just a procedural standard map. If we look at the material editor here, here is our radial gradient, and I animated the flag so you can see there's keys here at 10 and then at 70. And all that is this flag here moves across. Again, this is set to radial. I have a little bit of noise in here, 0.13, size 5, set to fractal, level 3, which is the default. That's all that is. And those two flags are, this one flag is animated, and eventually this whole sphere turns white from black, and that'll be our trigger texture. One side note here is, in the very first frame before I start, frame 10, I have the first flag. If you right click, edit properties, that flag is animated black, and then in frame 10 it's white, because I want to prevent that this is always there. What you could do is use different mapping on your object, and in your UVs, just scale the UVs and frame it out. All I did is animate this first flag from black to white, and then the same in the end when everything is white, everything but this little area here. If we go to flag 1, that goes from black to white. My interpolation is set to solid. I don't need any grayscales. This will be triggered by black or white, and we don't need any in-between values. So that's what I'm starting with. You can use whatever trigger texture your heart's content. I went the simple route with the geosphere. It's the default UVs. There's no modifiers on here, and it's a gradient ramp set to radial with a little bit of noise in it. And that's what I will use to trigger our tyFlow. Let us create our tyFlow object right here. Just click that anywhere in your scene, does not matter. And let's open the editor. I love that we have right-click presets flow now. That is a fairly recent addition, if I remember correctly. We're going to use a simple icon flow eventually, just to see how our noise pattern looks like. That does all the floaty bits floating away. In my case, that is literally the force that ships with tyFlow set to curl and purlin and whatnot, the noise functions that are embedded in the force operator. You can, of course, use a force follow and use a fume effects or Phoenix simulation to drive this and look more smoky if you so choose to. I just use the built-in tools because the whole point was to use only tyFlow. Here's your fluid force if you want to use Phoenix or fume. I will use that force. So that's just a heads up. We want to start with a burst object because we have our geosphere here. Again, standard geosphere, 32 segments. And we gonna load this in and display our stuff as geometry. And I'm gonna hide that for a second so we see our flow better here. This is now the tyFlow, and we're gonna use a phase fracture. I just hit F on the keyboard and it'll jump to that. Otherwise you can do tab here and type in phase and it'll also pop up. There's our phase fracture. Let's see what we got here by default. So we can kind of see, if you zoom in and hit F4, there is already a bit of fragmenting. If you zoom in, there's jaggedy edges already. To send them to another event when they're triggered by the texture, just for the test purposes of right now, I want to use a surface test, which is right here. I put that right below here, surface test. And we don't want to use distance. We are going to use texture, which is right here, texture. And as a map, we're going to load in a instance of the map we are using here, not gradient ramp. Let's call that trigger gradient. All right. Once this ever is done typing, okay. Here as an instance, so whenever we do changes to our gradient, this will update along with. And what I like about doing it that way is if you want to make the triggering faster or have it disintegrate for a longer period of time, all you need to do is go back to your original geosphere and drag out or push together the keys, and then it happens faster or slower. Excellent. We leave everything else as is, other than we want to trigger when it's white, not when it's black. So we choose argB greater than, and you can leave that at default. I think it would even work if you set this to 1, because it's literally black and white, no in between grayscale values. And that will trigger the event. Let's take another display operator and say geometry and make those, let's say, blue. Now, let's see what we got. Let's go to frame 0. And in the surface test, of course, we need to add our geosphere. We can hide this again. Now, if I scrub through here, the first couple of frames, nothing happens, because remember, my gradient does not change color until frame 10. So that's like your introduction period. And this is our face fragments. And eventually at frame 70, that's where it all turns black. 68, 69, 70, boom. They changed the event into the blue event. Now, this fracturing pattern does not look very natural. It might be super cool if you do a Tron-like disintegration where they are more blocky, or even squares. This is not what we're after. We want to do a more procedural, round, fragmenty type fragmentation. So let's make a few changes to our geosphere first, and then we jump back into the tyFlow. Alright, so tyFlow turned off. I'll unhide our geosphere here, and let's display that as just object color for the time being, and hit F4. We see our segments here, right? Now, let us make this an editable poly, and let's give it a bit more interesting pattern. Now, if I open my ribbons here, show ribbons, we have poly modeling and then generate topology. And there's a particular one that'll surface well here in terms of cooler looking crack edges, and that is the skin preset. And I click on that, and this is what I end up with. This is very random, kind of interesting, almost scale looking, like on a lizard topology here. And this is a cool pattern. That looks good breaking. You can play around with the others. I found skin works best. So again, that's show ribbon, poly modeling, and then you generate topology. So now let's put that back into our tyFlow. Let's turn that sucker back on. And we were in frame 36. And that's already a little better. It'll fracture triangles. And right now, every patch is about 10 polygons big. If we make that 100, we will get bigger patches. You can see how big the polygons are that are triggered on. What we can do to see the separation a little better, we can just put a force, no, let's do a speed, and random 3D should be sufficient. So now we see our individual pieces a little better. It's slightly better, it's not perfect yet. But for the remainder of this situation, the good news is we don't have to leave tyFlow. tyFlow has tools to subdivide and to give us a shell per particle and all that. So this is our first step to subdivide this sphere and make the edges look a little better by using a different topology from our poly modeling tools. So let's subdivide a little further so we have tinier faces. Shape, it's right here by the breaking, subdivide right here, and we put that above the face fracture, and by default edge lengths of 5, nothing happens. Let's try 2, nothing happens. 1, that'll be 1 iteration smaller, but I'm gonna go with 0.5, very small polygons here. And in our face fracture, let us, now that we have that many faces, make individual fragments that are 500 pieces and a random of, let's say, 100. It'll think for a second and then do it, and we will be in business. Now let us scrub through our triggered objects here. These are not. These are now looking a little better. Now we have polygons that are like shapes like this guy right here. That's kind of cool. And if you give this a shell and subdivide it and displace it all within tyFlow, they'll give us some cool results. You can always, of course, play and instead of triangles, try polygons. And now in the background, tyFlow is updating this for us. Here we go. It's kind of cooler shapes. What you want to get away from it essentially is those octagons. That's how tyFlow likes to break up the shapes and group them back together into faces per fracture. You can always also just play with the amount of faces. That'll make now smaller fragments, because it'll use 300 faces with a variation of 100 to group together to be a particle. I'm going to keep this at 500 for now. I want big chunks. There it is, updated. And again, this would be cool for text stuff. For what we want to do, we're gonna shell it and displace it, and give it a little different other patterns. Again, play around with those values here, triangles versus polygons, and then you'll get eventually get a little cooler shapes going on here. So let's see. Let's give this a shell so we have some depth to this. And what it'll do is it'll add an outer mount and an inner mount of 5 and 5 with some possibly some variation. We don't want outer mount. Our sphere should stay intact, and certainly we don't need 5 segments for the internal. We need 0.5, I would say. So it's more like, let's say, a little thicker than an eggshell, basically. That's what I did with that skull. Yeah, something like that. That's more like it. And if you want to render that, of course, in the end, you will always need a mesh in your event there. You can kind of see if we... Yeah, let's try that and break this up in the next step. Thinking about it, what we can do real quick to break this up nicely is, I'm going to unhide my geosphere again here, the edit poly. We can throw a tessellate modifier on top. That will, if we isolate select this, it'll take our skin pattern and keep that kind of as is. But tessellate, and the default values are fine. If you look at the pattern, you have smaller bits, smaller triangles, you have quads. Now this is really broken up into not homogeneous tris or quads. And that is a good thing to have if you want more organic looking edges. So let's try that real quick before we build our new event there, event 2, with all our forces. And let's see, hide the geosphere and get out of isolate selection. Now tyFlow, on top of that kind of detailed tessellation, is adding a subdivide, and that'll make for a lot of tiny edges because it'll break along the tries. So that's what I was thinking about for a second there. And now look at that. Now it's speeding fast. It's just the initial kicking in of the subdivide that will take a second, but it's totally worth it. Look at those shapes now. Aren't they cute? This is, I'd call organic. It might need a turbo smooth, and there's, you know, still the jaggedy, but you got away from this octagonal shape a little bit that is very predictable. I'm going to turn off the subdivide again, and we do this. See, this is those octagonal shapes is what I'm talking about. This is not too bad as is. Again, this is the retopologizing skin algorithm, and on top of that, just to tessellate. So this is not bad, but the shapes are all kind of the same, and I have to say, yeah, they look octagonal. So the subdivide is totally worth it, and that will only happen once. Once that has kicked in, tyFlow has that in the cache basically, and then you can scrub this lightning fast. Here we go. Boom. This is all writing 100 frames in the cache, and now we scrub faster than the viewport updates because I'm obviously recording in the background. So nice, sweet. Next, what we want to do is let's add a little spin and that good stuff to this. Give all this a bit of life here. And I eventually want to shrink the big pieces over time, smaller, 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 relative successive. Then I'm going to leave this at default right now. It's because it's a pretty good spin. We don't want them to spin super crazy, but you know, adding a little bit. I want to shrink them over time. And eventually then, once I'm kind of cool with what they are doing scale and spin wise, we're gonna make them a little jaggedy and subdivide them even further, which will help the displays to get nice noise pattern on there. So let's add a scale here, and what we want to do is relative multiply. And we don't want to multiply, we want to, I'll hit escape real quick to get rid of the subdivision. Actually, I'm going to turn this off for a second. Again, scale, not inherit previous, which is default. We want relative multiply. And the gag here is relative multiply. If you leave that default, not much is happening there. If you do values over 100, every call of the particle system, they will grow exponentially. Now we want the opposite of that. We want negative than 100% values, which will make them shrink. And it is just a little bit, break them up a little. Let's try 98. So over time, as you can see now, they are shrinking. I leave it at 99. I just want them to get a little smaller to help the disintegration of our purpose here. They shrink about a third in size currently over their lifetime. So that's not too bad. Instead of the speed, actually, let's dial in our disintegration force here. So let's use a force and replace the speed. That was just to see when they change event that they have done so. And we're going to use a curl noise and a purlin noise. You can of course use a tywind here in the helpers, tyFlow, tywind, if you so choose to, or the legacy forces, of course, here, vortex, wind, all those. We want to use the internal force though, because again I said we will only use tyFlow tools. So we leave the gravity, all this as is, and the first noise we're going to use is a curl noise with a very low strength. Those, just like the legacy forces, are pretty potent. We do a frequency of 1, or we can leave it at 0 actually for now, and the scale of 0.1. What that will do is, just like the legacy forces, the lower the number, the bigger the pattern is. So if I set that to 1, they'll kind of, the default, they'll kind of just wobble there. It's not doing, they kind of look wobbly. In their path, it's just a small force, small pattern trajectory. 0.1 and 0.2 is more what I'm after. That's cooler. 0.1 actually makes them, some are doing loops here. I'm not super fan of that. 0.1 is good. So that's our curl noise. Our second noise will be purlin, which is the default setting, and let's do a strength of 0.2 here, and we do a scale of 0.15. So slightly smaller. The higher the number, the smaller the pattern sizes. I know that's a bit confusing, but that's how the legacy forces were. That's what we had to deal with when we still were using P-array or the original P-flow. So that's not too bad of a pattern. They're kind of, especially the second purlin noise now, if you look at the bigger ones here, it gives them a nice a floaty feeling, like ashes, for example. And again, the pattern will be more organic once we turn the subdivide back on, but right now, for the sake of speed of this tutorial, I will leave it at that. And our things are shrinking slightly, which is nice. Let's do 98.5. Shrink. Nice. Next thing we want to do is we want to displace them. So they're getting jaggedy. Basically, I want them to wilt like a leaf in the wind. So we're going to subdivide them a little bit. In this case, with the default subdivide, the default of 5, and that does nothing until they enter that event. Then the subdivide, if you would read that text in slow, I will show you the pattern here. This is the original pattern, large. This is subdivided, which makes for more geo. You have more vertices, more faces that can be displaced, which will look nicer. And then we use a displace, and that bespoke displace, we're gonna use the built-in noise. You could use a texture map, of course, which again in the demo files, that is one of the scene files. And I'm gonna leave this all pretty default here. And yeah, strength you could lower a little bit so they're not totally even when they're not triggered yet, and then they trigger and they're completely jaggedy. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at 1 for now. And I'm gonna want to do one test with this subdivide on, just for the sake of seeing how nice our edges are, to see where we are. Because this is already this event. after some time X with a time test, I want to pass them on to the next event where we break them up even further, where we're going to use Verona Fracture and so on and so forth, all that good stuff. I let this sit for a second till we're at frame. Let's do 30. 30 is a good frame test-wise. Keying it from 10 to 70, around 30 is half the sphere, more or less, if you look at this. And yeah, this is cool looking edges. And they got a shell to it, a width. Same does the original shape, all that. This is cool. This is not bad. If you want less noisy pattern, of course you can go into the displays and do half the strength and even a bit more scale, but I kind of like it. This will look decent. You always got to think in terms of you know, add motion blur to this and whatnot, and you will have debris that come off the edges here and all that good stuff. To have actually debris emit off the edges, let's go on our shell real quick. You should override the material IDs. We can do that real quick. Let's go back to our first frame and give the outer an ID of 1 and the edge an ID of 2. I'm going to kill the subdivide again in a second, because this is given our nice detail, but it'll also, the initial frame takes a second to calculate. But anyways, yeah, in order to emit from the edges, we will need an ID dedicated to the edges, which luckily we have. And there we go, subdivide is off now. Give the shell some variation, and again, material ID for outer 1, inner we kind of keep, it's going to be the same, keep it 1, and edge material ID 2. If we scrub now, we have our bigger chunks again because the subdivide is off, but that's fine for testing. And you get some nice little individual pieces here that are, this is coming together. Yeah, we need edge IDs because later I want to do a spawn where when they break they spawn some particles, and then over time I want them to spawn by travel distance basically. But this is this event, and we can also copy paste over our tri-mesh, so this will also render. Let us let's build the initial break spawn. So we had a spawn which is up front here by the initiators, as they are called in thinking particles, and we're going to put that right under the displays. So all this curl noise happens, and we just, when they enter this event, I want to spawn some particles. And let's grab another display here and set that to, let's say, ticks, and make that an orangey color. And let's plug that in. So in our spawn, we do 100% spawnable offsprings per particle. I want, let's do 75. Or maybe even 100. Let's try that with a variation of, let's say, 33%. And they can inherit the velocity with some variation, all that, divergence. We're gonna give this event coming here its own set of forces, so that is not super important here. So what happens here is, once a particle is triggered, it spawns particles. Right now it spawns them everywhere, which is not what we want. We want them to spawn from the parent shape surface, there we go, and from material ID 2. Number 1 is the front and the back. Number 2 is the edge. Give that some variation is always good. Let's give it some variation, shall we? And now you have particles being born as our meshes are triggered on their shelled edges, much like you do in thinking particles. They're just sitting there, which is also interesting looking, I shall add. You could align them to the surface by the normals, but we do not need to do that right now. And this is literally all the edges of our fragments haven't spawned some particles now. Now that is not so interesting. We want to give them a force of their own and some spin and some rotation and all that good stuff. So let us copy all those operators and paste them into the new event and see what that gives us. We will not see the spin and rotation and all that stuff. Instead of, we don't need to scale those. Let's give them random rotation though. Override that. And that should give them the same curl noise. Let's make some changes to that, because if we just copy paste the same, it will be boring, right? So let's give this a bit more oomph, 1.5. The scale I want to keep kind of the same, so they're kind of in the same world still of their parent particles. And then in the Perlin noise, we can dial that down a bit. Let's do 0.12, but give them a bigger scale, like 0.1 or something, which again will make for a bigger pattern, or 0.07. Cut it in half. And there we go. This now will iterate lightning speed. And what you see here, this text that goes by and by and by, is the subdivide here in that to make our edges jaggedy. Let us dial back the strength a bit. There we go. And they go further out than their parent particles, which is all good. It looks kind of funky as the timeline progresses, but we're going to delete them over time, because those are tiny debris and they should just be dead by the end of our 100 frames here. So let's get a delete, which is right next to the spawns, and we want to delete based on the event age. Delete event age, and this should all happen after, let's say, 12 frames in this event, and 20 with a variation of 10. So some die just after 2 frames and some die after 30 frames. Let's see how that looks. Let all this update. I will turn off this subdivide as well real quick, because then we're really flying. I'll turn it back on when we go for our final looks. And here you go. These die pretty early, again, some at 2 frames, some at 30. But those are just the particles that are the tiny debris that spawned when they break. So just as they break, and then they have their kind of their own life, and then they fly off. Also, by the way, this is all obviously not using physics. They're all intersecting, but we're going to have so many particles that you can't really tell. Since we have that dialed in now, let us add some shape to this. Let's add a shape. Above the delete is probably fine. And we're going to use a 3D shape. And we have all those lovely presets in TyFlow. let us use chunks. They are right here. Chunks flat looks pretty good. That's all those little pebbles kind of. Again, we will make them tiny. We're going to give it a scale variation, and let's try 50 and 50 variation. And turn our display to geometry. And see, that's how fast I went to 20 frames. So we make our test frame literally 35, which would be half. And this is all our little edge pebbles. We look closer here. They're literally triggered when a particle switches to event 2, and then they kind of have all their own life. Let's make those a little bigger. Scale 75. Let's leave them at 100 maybe. It's yeah, let's do that. And they all have 15 random different shapes that are cycled through, and that's kind of cool. So now we have our little break particles that are just born when a piece breaks off the main shell, and again, they'll be all dead by the time we're at event 100. And so we'll actually be those guys too, or at least breaking into tiny fragments. This is our initial break particles. So now let's take care of our event 2 particles, our blue particles, the big guys. And I want them to be broken as they fly after a couple of frames, to be broken into smaller pieces, and eventually break a third time into really small pieces. And if you are used to thinking particles, this is like having multiple stacked volume breakers. So first you break your big chunks, or you have a pre-broken geometry and you use a fragmenter to activate those chunks, and then a little time later, or based on speed or properties like that, you break them further into another volume breaker, and then maybe 30% into a third volume breaker, stuff like that. And that's how it works in thinking particles. In tyFlow, it works, since it's an event-based system and not rule-based, it works in events. I'm going to turn off the spawn right now, which will save us some time. And we start with our tests. What I love, by the way, in the new tyFlow is that you can drag down here and it'll prompt you all the tests that you have. And we want to use a time test. After X amount of frames, we want to pass our particles onto a new event. And we can make those, let's make them really bright green. And while we're at it, let's drag down the tri-mesh so this will render, and our cache geometry. Our time test. We want to test based on event, and let's say 10 and 3. That's the default. Let's try that. That's pretty good. Let's make that 5. 10 and 5. So after that amount of frame, they switch to the green event, and they do. This is pretty cool. So they are big until they just kind of have shrunk a little bit and left their mother shell, essentially, and then they pass on to the next event, where we will break them another time. And this time we gonna use the Verona Fracture, because now we have meshes that are shelled. First, a phase fracture is for planes and something that doesn't have any depth to it. Verona is for volumes, basically. And we want to Verona fracture the green event meshes. And let's see by default what we are getting. There we go. They're all breaking into smaller chunks. That's cool. Probably more points. What more points will do is give us smaller chunks. There we go. Let's do 20 points, maybe. And if you want to display the point cloud, display show point cloud. That's the points that will be used to create those Verona cells that then eventually fracture your particles. So if we go to an earlier frame of one of those guys, let's watch this guy here. It'll take 10 frames and then some. Oh, this guy right here. Boom. He breaks into about 5 chunks. That's cool, because after time X, we want to break him again into very tiny chunks. After another time test with another Verona fracture. So what we actually can do is we can take the time test and this whole event, copy it, and paste it. Oh, that's just create another time test. Time test. And boom. Put that, doesn't matter, it can be above the match or below. And let's do a little bit more time here. Let's spend 12 and maybe 6 frames in this time test. And let's make this maybe purple. And let's see what that does. This can be the default 10 points. Let's scrub through that. So after 10 or so frames, they are breaking into the green chunks, and then after another 12 or so frames, if the event age is greater than 12, yes, they will break into the purple chunks, and that will be small, tiny. Look at those guys. But the shape's kind of nice. They're a little clumped up. And because of the jaggediness of our displays, they'll all be nice and wilted and jaggedy looking. So that's our event down here. And those guys I would like to scale down over time again. Same as here. Scale, multiply. Paste that in here. So they would eventually, the green ones I can live with, they will eventually break into the purple ones anyways, and then those are shrinking, and eventually by frame 100 they should be gone. So to shrink them faster, we can just lower this number here. Let's try 97%. And look how this is flying, frame 30. This is going to calculate all the way to 100. If they are, yeah, that's good. I mean, now they're super tiny with some randomness, of course, because of the randomness of how big our chunks are. You could then add another randomness and scale variation. But again, they're so tiny at this point. Like, look at those here. It really doesn't matter. You can add variation to everything and then even randomize every render value. Is it in utilities? Assign randomized multicolor material? No. I think there's a thing where you can randomize all of everything that can be randomized in one click. Anyhow. So this is our big chunks breaking into very small chunks. If you have a longer duration, they'll be gone. Like at frame 150 probably they have shrunken to oblivion. Right now all those pieces still follow the same Perlin noise force as their parent particles in event 2. In order to change that, we can just again copy and paste the Perlin noise and let us make another couple of changes. Let's give it a different scale. 0.06. This can be a bit more strength to it. This we lower to 0.14 and make this bigger maybe. Let's paste another one down here. I'm reusing a lot of my things here. Strength 0.08. A little higher scale, which makes the pattern smaller. Maybe 2.2 and a scale of 0.05. It's big. Just to randomize the force pattern in it. And that doesn't suck. If you want to have this all colliding with the ground, of course you can use a collision test and put a box on the ground or a plane or whatever. I pretend mine happens in zero gravity and it's all mid-air. So that's not too horrible. They all now have different noise patterns in their individual events and eventually break and then fly away to their own, according to their own tune, their own force curl noise. So I want to have that in every event with slightly different settings. That's the goal here. So now that we have our main chunks breaking off, plus our initial break triggered particles in the spawn, let's actually name that correctly. This is event 3. This is event trigger spawn. This is event fragment 1. We can copy that because we have event fragment 2 and event fragment 3. The next thing with the first one is rename event fragment 1. Maybe it doesn't like there we go, it doesn't like the hashtag #. This is our flow. We can call this tyFlow Disintegration. Alright, that is that. Let us build our spawning particles as they fly, our spawn by travel distance. And that I want to build actually in the event fragment 2. The ones they are tiny, the purple ones, they should have some floaters and create a lot of particles. That's when they are green, of course. In the second event, when they break into their second stage. And of course here paste little spin and little spin. So I'm actually recycling. It's a spin random. I'm literally recycling all the variation 25. And then in this one, let's do variation 20. It should not be too crazy. It should still be just slightly more than their parents. That's basically what I'm doing. Slightly more randomized. So everything will get a life of their own. And this is the real pieces breaking. This is not spawn particles. This is the fragmentation from our original fragments. And yeah, that's pretty cool. This is starting to come together, and we haven't even added our subdivision in yet. for breaking up those octagonal looking patterns. So for our event that is the trailers, we should add a spawn again to the event fragment 2 right here, and I put that right above the mesh. Do we want to scale those down slightly as well? You know what, let's do that. Let's go with the tune here and paste that in as well. So now all particles eventually scale down over time, just a hair to disintegrate. So I'm copy pasting. We don't need that on the tiny ones. They don't need to shrink over time. They'll just die and they'll be invisible. That's how small they are. So we spawn not once. We are spawning per second and by travel distance. No, per second, of course, not by travel distance. And we're going to spawn at a rate of 100. But first, before we do that, let us grab a display operator and display large dots and make this the lovely color red, which we haven't used yet. So at a rate of 100, and let's say variation 60%. This will spawn particles on the blue particles. And if you want, now I spawned them all on their, like on the entire surface. Because at this point, this is further in the simulation. This has the position rollout again, and we can limit this to material ID 2. Which will spawn off the crack edges. In the Verona Fracture here, is there a spinner? Let me see. For IDs. Anyways, let's see on an earlier frame. Once they become green, let's observe this guy right here. They're spawning off their edges. So that's cool. That is what I had in mind for those guys. And yeah, a rate of 100 will give us plenty of particles. But guess what? We will copy this whole event, trigger spawn, from our initial spawn, and paste that whole event down here, because it's basically the same enchilada. Let's delete this, spawn per second. Let's make this red. We want the curling noise again, and let's give this strength of 2. Those should be flying. The frequency I don't change. They were just floating through air basically. Let's do 0.07. Same down here at the purlin. Let's do 1.3. How does that sound? And scale 1.2. They're tiny, and we won't see much. It virtually does not matter. Delete. We can randomize that a little bit. Let's do 10 and 20 variation 15. I have a feeling we're going to extend to 150 frames because nothing will be gone just yet. That try-mash operator, of course, needs to live in all our events. Let's do that real quick. And, yeah, those tiny ones we don't need to shrink over time. Let's see, shape-wise, it should still be the pebbles. However, those particles are supposed to be tiny, tiny, tiny. I think to save memory and such, we are safe to just set this to triangles and we'll barely see a difference. There we go. So at this distance even, you can't tell that this is all just 2D triangles. There's too many of them to really make a difference. And we'll render this, of course, from a safe distance where we won't make out that this is just tris. There's literally too little of them. Scale-wise, make them a little smaller to 60% scale, and variation we keep at 50. So they're smaller. In case we would end up seeing a tri, at 75, let's do that. But yeah, again, this is so many that you won't really notice. Spawn per second rate, let's do 100. And again, guys, tyFlow, it's so fast. Frame 49, that should be it. Alright, this is pretty good. So all the red ones are secondaries, let's call them. I want to dial back this force here real quick. It's a little much. Let's do 1.3 and 0.9. I could have turned off the other events, but again, this is so fast. Maybe that's it. Just have them kick a little back. Strength 0, let's do 6. I didn't want them to fly away that fast from their parents, is all. Well. So, and again, all those fragments are actually deriving. This is not just spawning fragments like you would do in pflow. This is actually breaking them and deriving from their original parents with shell and everything. If you look at the edges, that's why we have the displays. That'll be all nice and jaggedy once that is on, and see how many particles that is. Hence, just a little tris. You will never tell. Displays wise, we have a subdivide up here in the displays in the fragments 1. Let us copy that and paste that into fragments 2. I won't change any of the settings. And on the last ones, the last fragments, it'll be the purple ones. They're so small you won't tell. So now the green ones are a bit more jaggedy than their their parents, the blue particles. Scale, you know what, actually let's make the scale 0.6 or something, so they're smaller jaggedy. This is a noise, just like the noise modifier in Max. So since they're smaller particles, there should be a smaller noise size. And strength wise, that's good. We keep it at 1. Scale and 2.5. Strength of 1 is good. Maybe we see. Let's scrub through this situation, and actually let's turn off the spawn per second. So we see our jagged edges. There we go. Look at those. Again, once this right now has no subdivisions on their site. Once this subdivide and this subdivide are on, this will be so dense and tris that you cannot tell a single face from each other. That's when we're getting at really nice edges and really nice jaggediness here. These will have detail on the inside. There's a tutorial that ships with the files you can download when you download tyFlow. Again, that is right here, the example files. There's a displays tutorial that goes over all that. It's a scene file. And it will explain how you do that. It's basically literally subdividing this place. That is the operator you want to use. And that is basically it. Let us see how this looks like when we turn on all our spawners and our subdivider. Alright, hold on to your butts, to quote Sam Jackson in Jurassic Park. And it says press escape to abort subdividing meshes. Again, this only happens in the very beginning, well, and then in the event fragment 1. This will take a second, and here we go. All this text right now says it is adding the other second subdivide to the event once they are blue that triggers the second fragmentation. And again, if you see, that's a bit too much displacement here for my taste right now on the second set of fragments. But look at the edges now. This is nice. You get some internal displacement going on. So let's go into this place right here. Maybe a little less. You know what? Let's see how it looks like. But I like that we've gotten away a little bit from the octagonal shapes. There's some interesting stuff going on. Let's have it go through. Again, this will, right now it adds the second subdivide because not all blue particles have been triggered yet in the event fragment 1. Ultimately, I would export this as a Ty cache, of course, for rendering, and then you don't have to wait on the displays anymore. Yeah, the displays is a bit much. Let's do 0.3. So it's displacing to the extent where there's normal flipping and such. That is not what I had in mind. But you know, you just copy paste operators from event to event and make slight adjustments to them. Let us see in a second how this looks when we zoom out a bit. On this skull here, it has the same mesh density, because it's a 3D scan, a raw scan, as the sphere once the first subdivide kicks in. And the fragment size is about the same. Which is the first phase fragment here, 500 phrases per fragment with a variation of 100. So some are 600, some are 400, etc. The reason those fragments look cooler is because the shape is not just a sphere. It's rougher. It is very dense and in small spaces. So tinier triangles and bigger quads in the more even spaces like the skull. But look at those break edges here. This is cool stuff, and this is basically what our sphere is doing too. Here and in our first displays, maybe scale that a little and do a bit more strength. But let us go with it. Let's simulate this through at least till the end. Have it playing once with everything on, and then you can throw shaders on it, etc. To render an ashing effect, for example, I would render this sphere actually 3 times, twice the effect and once just the sphere. The reason being, I can adjust when the ashing happens in comp. Otherwise you'd create a mixed material, and in the mixer you would throw the gradient ramp that we so craftfully created to trigger all this, to switch from one shader to another, either in the same shader with a mixed material for the diffuse, or you would use a, let's say, a V-Ray blend material, and in the blender you would throw literally the exact same gradient ramp that triggers all this, and you go from regular, let's say it's a piece of paper or whatever, a statue crumbling, regular marble, to ash shader, and you just use the same gradient ramp as blend, and boom. I would do that on the tycache though, and not on the tyFlow, because all this business here, the updating, etc., none of this will happen once this is cached. I'm going to let it sink for a second, and then I'll play this for you. So here is our lovely disintegrating sphere. And yeah, it's all about triggering cooler looking patterns than just the hexagons that phase fracture tends to produce. I mentioned that in the tyFlow in our Facebook group, that it's a little predictable and a little monotonous, I'm saying. But that's what it is, and that's why we use again our subdivides, and we use our retopologizing tools from the ribbon. It was the poly tools back then. It's now built into Max. The more interesting your topology looks, the more interesting your fragments will look. That's the bottom line of it. And if you want more and smaller fragments as your initial fragments, all you need to do is lower the phase count per particle and play with the randomness. Right now this is 500. It'll take about 500 tries in this case, and make that one piece of fragment, one particle. If you want them to be half the size, do 250, and then you'll get half the size blue fragments. That's literally it. That concludes this tutorial. I wanted, when this updates, there we go. Yeah, this is kind of cooler. This is now less displace and no more face intersection. This is coming together, and again, if you wanted to change the timing on this, all you need to do is go to your geosphere and shove together or drag apart the keys, and it'll happen slower or faster. It's all triggered by one procedural map. That is how I would do disintegration in TyFlow, not using any particles. Now, as I mentioned before, I wanted to show you an alternative for the trigger mechanism that's not a procedural map. So I want to open a file that I opened right before starting this. I'm going to save this. And it is part of the demo files. If you download the demo files from the TyFlow website, the beta site, this is in the miscellaneous MISC folder. And this is the scene file as it comes. And I'm going to just go to frame 50 and let it think for a second. Or maybe a little further. This is called TyFlow Neighbor Virus version 001. what this does is it has a distance test. Let's read this piece of geometry, the little box. That's within a certain radius of the blue particles that just live on each vertex of this torus knot. They will eventually, with a little time randomization, engulf this whole torus knot like a skin rash, or it's called virus. Let's see, this is all the way through. Man, tyFlow is fast, nice. So that'll eventually affect this, and you can use this very same technique instead of a grayscale map to put your first event particles into the next event that spawns the blue particles, which is just activating your phase fragments. Let's look at this tyFlow real quick. Instead of the burst surface, you would have the burst shape. You use your phase fracture. That'll give you the individual particles. And then you do the surface test. Actually, let's do that real quick. So instead of burst surface, we use a burst object. And let's make a duplicate of this torus. Tool, snapshot, single snapshot, and let's hide the first one real quick. Torus knot 2, okay, add selected, boom. And then we do a phase fracture. This should already be nice and dense. Let's do 50 phases per. So that's 50 of those tris or quads per fragment. Same here. What Tyson did here is literally taking a default torus knot and throw a subdivide on it with a size of 3. Let's do try size of 2. Actually, we are using our other snapshot torus knot. We could put a subdivide on top of this, but let's just see what happens. Height selection, display, big dots. Let's see if the system itself still works. Yes, it does. And let's get rid of the shape. Delete. And instead of big dots, let's show geometry, and it'll scale them over time and scale them back down. We can kill that, delete. I just want to see them triggered. And boom, this is essentially how you would do this with our disintegration system. You need a bigger radius because our tiny particles that sit on every vertex are a little closer together. And now you see all those fragments eventually triggered. Let's do a radius of 20 maybe. Or smaller fragments. There we go. So over the radius you control how fast this happens. But long story short, guys, this is the same system. Once you are out of the time test, below here you would do a second fragment and go over the tutorial I just recorded. This is just a separate trigger mechanism I want to show you guys, either by texture or by neighbors. And all this time test does is given this randomization, so you have some, get this little patches ahead and those little sitting here. It's kind of cool. So copy paste those operators over once you've done the tutorial, or just rebuild them, and you got yourselves 2 trigger mechanisms to pick from. I think the magic number is 14 to have every single phase triggered. Some shapes are off the nature that they would never fall within the distance threshold here, which is an absolute radius of 14. And yeah, this is the same thing. If you have bigger fragments, you need a bigger radius to check. If you have smaller fragments, you need a smaller radius to check the distances. And that is literally the end. Here is what I have open in the background is my cached skull. It is frozen right now in time, and I have a camera. You could have a camera rotating around and whatnot. You do this different than you do in point cache or a PRT loader for Krakatoa and such. To freeze a cache, you turn on retime. There's tutorials about the retimer in the demo files in tyFlow. Again, download those, observe them back and forth, please. So enable the retimer, set your speed to 0, and then pick a frame that's kind of cool. That's all you need to do. And then you have a frozen cool cache. You can then, you know, do use it for a poster or whatever, you know, for promotion stills, whatever it may be. You need a frozen version of. That's how you do it. If I undo the retimer, here's a skull. I'm going to turn on standard shading because that'll the viewport ambient occlusion will take its toll on the playback speed here. And this is all cached. You can send this to the farm. Again, this is the exact system that we just built. Right here, all this, don't need that. And this is the other, as I mentioned, this is the other trigger mechanism by neighbors that I just showed you. But all this down here is what we just did. And I will leave you with a cool frame here. Look at that guy. What a beauty. So yeah, to conclude this, again, the topology of your start mesh will determine how detailed and cool your edge fragments and such will look like. So have a fairly high poly count to begin with, by using subdivide modifiers, for example, or turbos moves, or tessellate. Play around with those type of modifiers. Retopologize your stuff with the generate topology rollout, and polymodeling, generate topology. And then use subdivides within tyFlow. It doesn't all have to be high res. Just keep in mind that the subdivides will calculate every time a fragment that has subdivide on it will be triggered. So bear that in mind when you wonder why your simulation is really slow. The subdivide can put a dent on that because it's actually subdividing the mesh. And yeah, this is this skull dissolving from this very video that I will play one more time, and then I'll leave you to it. Again, I'm Ansi. Join the tyFlow Facebook group. Find me on the interwebs. I'm easy to find. And thank you for watching.